Okay, let's get started. So just real quick, cover who I am and how I'm bringing this data to you. So I run cybersecurity delivery for AGIO. We're an organization about 300 employees. We're headquartered in New York City, operationally centered in Norman, and the cybersecurity operations centers in the Raleigh-Durham RTP area of North Carolina. And then we've got various other small office locations. The reason I even mention this is the data that I'm providing you today, while some of it is available via various sources, much of the data and the use cases are based on what my incident handlers, our MDR and EDR analysts, and our pen testers are seeing out there in our client space, which is a large portion are healthcare providers, business associates, and other types of organizations. So our vision as an organization is to empower you and our clients with secure, reliable, and resilient information systems. And the reason this is a key for us is because, as you know, if you're following the media, if you've experienced an event, you're not going to be able to prevent every attack from getting in. I'm not suggesting you're all going to have a data breach. However, the ability to withstand and recover from these attacks, resilience, if you will, is going to make is going to set you apart from others. It's going to allow you to continue to operate, maybe in a degraded mode for a while, but continue to serve your patients and provide good care. So the agenda today is pretty light. We're just going to do a quick level set, talk about protecting your organization, how to raise awareness amongst your users, and then give you a checklist to take back to your organizations and sort of review with those individuals or organizations, third parties that may be providing IT and or cybersecurity services. So real quick, as we go into the level set, I'd like to use this opportunity to take a quick poll on ransomware. You can just go ahead and ask that first poll. That'd be great.
No worries, we'll do. So here you go, folks. As always, please participate in this poll. Very standard question. Do you feel your organization is prepared to prevent and defend against ransomware? Very simple yes or no answer. I'm going to leave this up for another 15 seconds or so as we allow as many people to participate as possible so we can get a good gauge of the room here. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And there we go. Okay, share the results. There you go, Ray.
Yep. Wow, so that's good. 70% of you feel prepared. Great. 31% not. 69, 7, 31. We're going to cover this. We're going to cover a use case specific to this in a later part of the presentation. Thank you. So, healthcare organizations are facing an average of 90 attacks a day on ransomware. So. This may vary from organization to organization, but the reality is we're all being probed continuously, and then about one, and I think X amount of emails, which we'll cover, are a way into our 3,000, as this shows, contain malware or a link to a site that contains malware. So some interesting stats here. I think you can read for yourself. There's an increase in the attacks fueled by the pandemic. There's an increase in the ransom demand. It's up a little bit. What's interesting is there's a downturn in the number of days of downtime. But there has been another tactic that's been employed, and that's after the ransomware holding a threat or threatening the organization to expose the data, which then of course creates another challenge as it relates to data privacy. One of the stats I find alarming to me is we'll cover this here later, is the misconfigured RDP ports open to the internet. It's unbelievable how many they are. And what I call this is what we call accidental administration or just errors on the part of an organization or an administrator that often lead to dire consequences. So anyway, I think we all get that there's a challenge out there. There's an increase in the attacks. An increase in what's driving this, but it's all being driven by money. So what interests me is, I think what we're going to cover today is not foreign to anyone, and much of what I'm going to cover you already know, but it's really about sort of taking the opportunity to dig in a little bit to some of the basics. And while many organizations that we work with have good solutions in place, they're not always maintained as they should be, and they're not always configured and deployed throughout the whole organization, and which leaves gaps in their surface area. And it's those gaps that get exploited by the bad guys. So, as you can see, there is an increased concern in healthcare, and government organizations are involved. Sharing the information can be challenging in many sectors, but I have found that the sharing of information in healthcare and state and local governments is top notch, using the different organizations to share the ISACs and so on and so forth. If you're not already consuming some of their content, you should consider that and sign on and support it. So what are we seeing in our clients organizations, hospitals, third parties, and so on? We're seeing, as you would expect, ransomware amongst the healthcare providers, phishing and wire fraud attempts, business email compromise, which is usually paired with account takeovers. We are seeing some bots and worms and some of these newer variants of the malware. There has been a change, of course, that started about this time last year, really about April or May, because of the pandemic, and we saw an uptick in information, an uptick in the hunger of globally of individuals wanting to know more and more, and they were being misled and led to sites that were what I'll call watering holes, that had active code that were probing, for vulnerabilities in web browsers and so on and so forth. Of course, as you are well aware, OCR, the FDA, and different states are addressing things and becoming more mature and evolving with respect to their knowledge and what they look for with as it relates to data privacy. So the threat landscape, typically starts with social engineering, and the bad actors work their way in. They leverage things like trusted applications or components of an operating system like Windows, for example, to what we call live off the land. We're not really going to talk about advanced persistent threats or that sort of thing today. We are going to focus more on where we're seeing the largest effort again from the bad actors, and where we're seeing sort of the things start to deteriorate and cause covered entities problems. So, the cyber kill chain is presented by Lockheed Martin. This is our rendition of it. As I stated earlier, we're always under reconnaissance. There are individuals or automated systems probing the lines, 24/7 for most organizations. And what we're looking to do is identify those areas where we can help organizations avoid those mistakes and not allow the bad actors to get any further than the reconnaissance phase. And we see some common things out there. There's about 4 things that an organization would take to heart and not just deploy, which I'm sure many of you already have, but also maintain. And what I mean by that is to assess, reassess, and ensure that the controls and safeguards you have in place are effective and performing the function to which you intended them to do. And so I look at it as, simple things like multi-factor authentication for any and all systems that support it, particularly if you're accessing them remotely. When you're not able to do that, then a strong password, of course, managed by a password manager, adding the latest updates to, systems as required, and then making sure that your public-facing systems, your external footprint is well maintained, and you're not accidentally exposing systems or services that you're not intending to as an organization. And that really takes what I would call a daily sweep of your entire public footprint, or hourly in some cases, to ensure that someone hasn't accidentally exposed a port like an RDP port, for example, unintentionally. I would also suggest that if you are moving or you have moved into the cloud for some of your key systems and platforms, such as Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, that it is much easier for an administrator today to put something on the internet unintentionally than it was in years past. As many of you know, in many organizations, to configure a system or provision a system and get it connected to the internet can take the coordination of 2 or 3 or more people. With the cloud-based technology nowadays, one individual, a couple of clicks, and they've unintentionally exposed something to the internet that they hadn't intended on doing. So, you know, keeping visibility on your surface is critical. So why should you even care about that? Well, there's the obvious. Patient safety is the primary goal of all of us in the organizations that we're working in and supporting. There is a concern about a reputational hit or fines, penalties, and resolution actions, resolution agreements, if you will. And then, of course, litigation. You know, right now, where we stand in 2021, OCR's reported 25 breaches, 34 in January, 38 in February. We've already had 3 in March, or we're just barely in the month, or we're almost halfway, I guess, Monday. 24 of these have over 10,000 patient records affected, and 52 of these were related to hacking. These include organizations like Walmart, Walgreens, Nissan, which isn't really related to what we're talking about today. So how do we address this? I really take a 360-degree approach to things. And this is one of those things that you can take and use when you're talking with your IT teams or your cyber teams or providers if you're using third parties for certain features or functions. You know, this is what I look at. I look at this as a lifestyle change. It's not a crash diet. You have to understand that this is continuous. It starts in the center here, what I'll call the center of gravity. Around, you know, policies, procedures, workflows around data, users, vendors, and regulations. And then we'll start on the left. You configure and verify. You have to secure your devices. You have to secure your data. You have to secure your users. And what I mean by that is you have to train and educate them and test them. You need to be able to detect and respond. You need to understand when user behavior or the environment is deviating from an established baseline. You have to have an established baseline. An example I'll put out there is if you would never know that a workstation in your environment has connected to some system out there on the internet at 3 a.m. on a Thursday and transmitted or received a lot of data. If you don't have that sort of visibility into your environment, then you don't have what I would consider adequate, you know, an adequate awareness of what's going on. And you wouldn't know necessarily if you deviated from that baseline. You need to be testing and ensuring the systems and safeguards that you have in place are effective and they're being maintained. And then you need to take the results of those assessments, those technical tests, penetration tests, red team exercises, and user testing. And you need to feed that back into an improvement phase and then continue the cycle. So how do we help organizations? And so what is our approach? You know, a defense in depth approach, sort of a layer approach is the way to go. Just because you have a state-of-the-art and a robust endpoint detection and response or EDR solution doesn't mean that it's going to pick up on a 100% of every variant of malware. So you need to have, you know, you need to have what I'll call compensating controls for the deficiencies in the known deficiencies in systems and unknown deficiencies, the ones you can't anticipate. Email threat protection and phishing protection, which sometimes are combined, but can be different solutions. Endpoint detection and response, you know, an application-aware IPS capability, which may or may not require you to offload SSL traffic, which are often provided, the capability provided by a next generation firewall, as well as extended detection and response, not just the SIM, but you know, taking the inputs from these different data sources and providing an enriched operational picture that analysts can use to begin threat hunting when something seems to be deviating from an established norm. This all gets wrapped into an incident response sort of posture that the organization, your organization, should be at the ready to execute at any given point in time. So real quick, I want to cover what we call you know, the basics, brilliance in the basics. I often get asked, can we not just spend this away? Can we not just spend this problem away? And while there may be a certain amount of investment required, when I look at the root cause analysis of many of the incidents my team handles, it's often a failure in the basics and not some single or one single technology platform. It may be the beginning or the inroad, but other things have failed along the way. So things like policy, strong passwords, network segmentation, a strong backup that works and has been tested, you know, and understanding where your data is in the organization These are all the things on the top line that every organization should have addressed and answered and have, I would say, a mature posture on. You have to understand your threats, and I think most of us do understand that well, even as they're evolving. You have to identify your data, and some of it's obvious for us. Electronic protected health information, yes, but there's other data that is of value to the bad actors that should you be able to, should you not be able to use the data, would cause a major problem for the organization. You need to understand what the risks are to that data being accessed by an unauthorized entity, individual, or system. And then ultimately, you need to understand what's the probability that a threat would exercise against a known or discovered vulnerability. And what's interesting this year for me is that errors have come alongside social engineering with respect to data breaches. And this, of course, is what I've already covered: accidental administration, exposing a port or a system unintentionally, or in some cases, sending that sensitive data to an unintended recipient because of auto-populate in an email. So once you've gone through this, what I'll call deliberate risk assessment process, you take the output of that, and then you would weave in solutions, more complex solutions, depending on the need, the organizational type, and the other things you have going on. And this is often a function of time, and time of your own staff or third party, or in some cases there is a spend required. But putting in egress filtering, meaning blocking everything, or SSL offloading, which is a separate thing. Phishing protection, honeypots, or deception technology. Threat intelligence feed, virtual desktops can provide a lot of security, not appropriate for every organization. Conditional access, and then file level encryption as required. So what happens when the basics on the top row are ignored? And what we see time and time again, business email compromise, account takeover, which can lead oftentimes to compromised systems, data, and fraudulent wire transfers for organizations. It can that are expecting to use some of that budget, and all of a sudden it's gone. Ransomware, we've already talked about. You may have some availability challenges, which we'll cover here shortly. And then there's, of course, the regulatory and reputational consequences. And I think many of us are familiar with, what happens when you have to report a major data privacy breach, over 500 records. That brings the organization under scrutiny, review, and it's very time intensive and involved. There are some examples here of solutions that we've had success with. We've also seen these solutions, like the ones in the middle, not catch everything. So again, defense in depth approach, an approach that has sort of a layered defense, so that if one system fails, you'll at least get a warning from another that something's amiss, and you have the ability to stop the spread of, in this case, the use case something I'm describing, ransomware, before it can take out the entire organization. So the first use case I want to cover, and by the way, I've changed names, I've changed locations, I've changed some of the facts to protect, but these are based on real events that my team has dealt with. So the first one I want to talk about is about a hospital system that actually fell victim to ransomware. This happens more often than you would think. In this case, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. They had a lot of good practices in place. There was, a little over 100 systems impacted, and their EHR was taken offline for a number of days, 3 days, to protect it, not because it was affected, but to keep it protected. That was the goal here, until things could be stabilized. Some things that would have prevented this would have been, better geo-blocking and egress, and ingress filtering, or egress filtering as well. Anti-phishing and anti-malware, as well as DNS awareness and protection. Oftentimes, what we see is the bad actors using DNS as a command and control channel, and it's very difficult to do anything about that without certain technologies in place. What we did, password auditing and resetting of accounts here, we analyzed the risks, and then we had to move fast. And if any of you have been involved with a live ransomware event, time is of the essence, and you can't waste any time. Otherwise, it can spread, it can take out, more of the organization than is tolerable. So the next use case, the bad actors actually weren't successful here, but what we did see was, a common tactic, a third party gets compromised. Imagine one of your third parties, a trusted third party, they have the issue, their security controls and safeguards aren't mature, and they become a victim and are unaware of it. And then the bad actors use them to try and obtain additional victims. In this case, because the bank didn't transfer the money, there wasn't there wasn't any significant loss. However, there was an embarrassment. There was a number of individuals and other organizations that had to be contacted because they were sent a copy of the same sort of communication that had a payload in it, if you will. In this solution, ultimately, had they had multi-factor authentication in place, it would have been a non-issue. And then finally, the one I want to cover is where there was an actual loss of money, about 250K. Organization was sort of duped into paying on an expected invoice, but to a different destination, if you will. And by the time it was realized, the money was gone, and they still owed the money to the organization that they had actually contracted with. Here, simple prevention would have been user awareness and training, password managers, and what I'll call validation of any wire transfer instructions. And the simple thing here is what I'll call penny drop. If anything ever changes with respect to wire transfers, you should always do a quick penny drop. Your organization should to confirm in an out-of-band method that this is a valid change. And then another side note, guys and gals, wire transfers in the afternoon on Friday are just a bad idea all around. Not that you can't get support, but it becomes much more challenging as we're heading towards the weekend. So as I transition to sort of user awareness and education, I want to just go ahead and start. We'll go ahead and launch that next poll, please.
Fantastic, no worries. So this next poll is all around validating your endpoint solution. How often have you validated your endpoint solution? 3 options, very straightforward stuff: annually, never, or what is an endpoint solution? Okay, let that run for a little bit longer. Let as many people participate.
That's good to see.
Okay, okay, another 3 seconds here, guys. Okay, there you go, Ray.
That's great. Wow. So the vast majority of the respondents, 93%, are validating that annually. That's excellent. And here's why I think that's excellent, because what we have found when we do root cause analysis is that depending on the endpoint solution, those 4 that I showed you earlier, we're familiar with those. Depending on how it's configured, oftentimes you have to change the default policy, or some orgs intend to leave the default policy, the one that's shipped with the platform, intact as it came from the vendor. The problem with that is it's often in listening mode. So what happens is people change, new people come in, take over duties. Cutting to the chase, you start deploying new systems in your organization. People the administrators deploy the default policy. The default policy isn't the one you've worked on. Therefore, you start having new systems out there that have a policy that is just in monitoring mode. Ultimately, what happens is, I'm sure you all can kind of connect those dots, is that those systems are thought to be protected, but they're not really protected because endpoint policy is just monitoring. Therefore, they are susceptible. So when it comes to training your end users, I look at it this way. It's not necessarily about drilling in all the technical details, which some are going to be very interested in that, but it's really about just consistently applying best practices that is going to yield a safe environment for you and your organizations. So we take a brilliance and a basics approach to user awareness as well. We divide these into technical recommendations and behavioral recommendations. So from a technical recommendation, and I apply this to, you, the covered entity, your business associates, as well as just end users. The same concepts should apply to their personal computing lives. And in many cases, those personal and professional computing lives are becoming inextricably linked. So multi-factor authentication, we've talked about this. I can't, we can go on and on about this. If a system or service accepts multi-factor, it should be enabled. it would remove so much of the challenges we see with respect to data breaches and account takeovers. Apply updates often. Now, we can talk about SolarWinds. That's a kind of an outlier, but generally speaking, you want updates applied when they're available. Use a password manager for passwords, particularly for those systems that don't accept or it's not practical to use multi-factor. And then have antivirus. Have a solid, and I should correct myself, we don't really call it antivirus anymore. Have a strong and robust endpoint protection solution in place, even on things like Macs. And then back up your data, guys. I mean, I think that goes without saying. However, getting back to, and we probably should have done a poll question around this, is how often are you actually testing restoration or operating in a degraded mode? Because if you're not doing that, then your day may come when you have to. And if you're not familiar with it, you're going to be learning as you go. It's kind of like building the plane as you fly, and it's not a good idea. Password managers are pretty straightforward. I'm not trying to sell you a password manager, but I liken this to, a password manager is like keeping the keys to your house in a lockbox when you're showing it versus just leaving it under the doormat. You want to have a password manager, again, for all those systems that don't take multi-factor. Behavioral recommendations. Your organization, the key players in the org, end users in general should be aware of what's available about them. We've had a couple of events where bad actors have followed individuals that work in an organization, or they just happened upon somebody who announced that they just landed a new position on the analyst team of a hospital. Bad actors target them pretending to be the CFO, ask for information over the weekend. The new analyst supplies it. One example I can think of is all the W-2s. Months later, people figure out that someone's already filed taxes and they can't file theirs. And then, I think you can connect those dots. Don't trust money. Don't trust email to move money ever. Email should never be an acceptable way. This includes in your personal lives. I can think of a couple of victims we've dealt with that lost money from what they thought was a closing. From a closing they were doing, but it was sent to the wrong account, if you will. Be aware of threats of pain. If something that you or your users are receiving via email, text, pop-up message that is fostering a sense of urgency, that should be a red flag, and you should step back and think about what you're getting ready to do. And is there another way to do this? Can you call the organization directly? Can you go from a stored favorite or just manually type in the address versus clicking the link? Be suspicious of all emails. I would freeze your credit. And then, we suggest checking haveibeenpwned.com. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It's a legitimate site supported by Microsoft Security Director. There are robust sort of industrial grade solutions available for entities. But on a personal level, it's good to know if an account you've been using has shown up on the dark web in a data breach. And if it has, what's your action? Well, reset passwords. And if you've used that same password with any other account, of course, change those. And then some advanced recommendations from a technical side. Log as a guest user and not administrator. We shouldn't be running in the context of admin, particularly on our home systems. Of course, use a VPN when on Wi-Fi. If you have the need to travel to certain parts of the world, we recommend burner devices, and that's a whole another discussion. Happy to take that offline. Use separate email accounts for various services. I do. Make sure your devices are encrypted. And then, while this may not seem intuitive, all things being equal, you're safer resetting a password to an account on an iPhone or an iPad than you are on any other device today. If you're at a conference and you've got to get into a computer on the business center to do something, send something or print something, if you use it, assume that password is going to be compromised and change it immediately after you do that, but do it on your phone. So I just want to talk about a few indicators of compromise. If your antivirus, and all these slides you can repurpose for your own organizations, by the way. Things that should be indicators for you, your teams, your end users on a personal level or in the environment. If the endpoint detects something, if you're not able to log in, if of course if something is stolen, if you're receiving a lot of undeliverable receipts, or you've made a mistake, the point I try to make here is bad news doesn't get better with age. It's not like fine wine. And it should be reported immediately so that the compliance team and the compliance professionals can get everything going to sort of do damage control. That's just something to consider. And then a final reminder for everyone is, don't store documents locally. Verify the internet connectivity. This is a lot for deploying from home from COVID. Locking the devices when not in use. I know a lot of this, many of you are already familiar with, but you'd be surprised at how often these basics are ignored. And then finally, what I want to talk about or just show you, and you can make use of this, not every one of these will apply to every individual and every covered entity or business associate, but it's a good starting point. Checklists. Can you or someone in your organization point to your incident response plan, or who's on the incident response team? Do you have legal counsel available? Do you have a warm relationship with somebody that, should you have a data privacy breach that's significant, that you could engage, and you're not trying to figure out a working relationship in the moment of things? Do you have a good threat intelligence feed for your organization, or does your cybersecurity provider have that? Are they using that with the services they're providing? Do you have a solid CMDB? Do you know all the devices that are connected? I know this gets very difficult, particularly in healthcare, with respect to medical devices that should be on their own segment. But if we take those out of the discussion just for a moment, assuming that they're in their own segment, all other what I'll call end user devices do you have a solid inventory of those and understand what version level they're on, what revision of signatures the endpoint detection has, and so on and so forth? When was the last time these things checked in? Do you have a solid XDR capability that can detect malicious, suspicious, and anomalous activity? And the rest you can kind of read. From a proactive standpoint, you should be conducting tabletop exercises regularly and working through real world scenarios that you can read about. You can take one away from here. Are you securing your desktops? Are you assessing your third parties? Third party risk is huge. It's sort of the Achilles heel, I think, of any organization. The latest event from Microsoft, or the latest vulnerability on Exchange, on-prem Exchange servers, as well as the SolarWinds, kind of drive that point home. And then I've already talked about threat intel. And then finally, the reactive things to be considering are device verification, monitoring remote activity, securing those work from home platforms, and protecting your staff from fakes, to include news, which we saw a huge uptick, like I stated back, April, May, June of last year. And with that, I want to launch that final poll.
Okay, coming your way, sir. So final poll here, guys, is all around biggest cybersecurity concern in 2021. What is your organization's biggest cybersecurity concern? Ransomware, business email compromise, phishing, or third-party risk? Let's leave this up for a little bit. I appreciate it could be, it could have been a multiple choice type of thing where you could select all that apply to a certain extent, because I'm sure they're all a little bit of a concern, but let's leave this up for another 4 seconds and then share the results. Okay, folks.
Yep. Well,
there you go.
Yep, phishing takes it, with ransomware as a close second. And those could be combined, but they're not always combined. And that's why they're separate here, team. Third-party risk, and then business email compromise. Okay, great. So with that, that's really all the content I have. I'm happy to take questions. We can continue, I'm happy to stay on as long as necessary to answer any questions, and we can always take any conversations offline.
Yeah, let's do it. No, there's plenty of questions flying in. So let's really just get kind of started right from the top, really. First question coming in from Danny Jones is, to what degree are ransomware attackers employing AI? Interesting. Are you aware of ransomware attackers employing AI?
So great question. I don't know specifics on AI. What we have seen is actual ransomware as a service. We've seen unsophisticated attackers leveraging platforms they're paying for to deliver ransomware, and as sort of a revenue stream. But I don't have any solid answer on AI. I would imagine the large and more well-funded, sophisticated organizations are using, and of course the nation states, I'm sure, are using it, but I don't have any stats to support that.
No worries. How do you suggest a healthcare system protect against bot attacks on their IoT devices? Many of them run Windows 7 and are never run security updates. Replacing all of them is cost prohibitive.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Segmentation and having those, if possible, depending on the complexity scale, types of networking infrastructure equipment used, placing those on their own separate VLAN, their own segment, if you will, that's monitored and well contained. And it has very strong access control lists that are feeding, an XDR platform that would include a security information and event management platform, so that when there's get a baseline established, protect it, can keep everything from going in and keep the things in from going out, except to communicate with the platforms they must on specific ports protocols. But understanding the nature of the traffic, and then when something changes, and having the ability, and this takes a very robust and mature network management capability, having the ability to shut off particular systems when they start indicating, or showing signs of something's, not right, instead of having to shut off the whole VLAN and stop service to other patients, for example.
Thank you very much. This is a really interesting comment and question. After a recent ransomware attack, we were asked to pay 1.9 million in Bitcoin. We had all our data backed up. When snuffing the bad actors, they threatened to publish the personal information. They threatened to publish and sell our data. After consulting with the FBI, insurance, and our management team, it was decided to pay them. It was much less. The FBI ensured that they wouldn't publish if we pay them, because it would ruin their business model. Thoughts and comments on that? I mean, this question comes up: do you pay? Don't you pay? In this instance, they paid. I'd love to get your insight there, Ray.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I don't know if this is pre or post the recent sort of edict from the federal government about that very thing, and it's not officially supported. So it would be helpful to understand that. But I'm going to assume it was before that. We take an approach that you should not pay. However, that's a good plan B, particularly if you're an actual health provider, meaning you're providing healthcare to patients. You have to have a backup plan. At the end of the day, patient safety is the top priority, and if it's going to have if you're going to have an impact on that, then that would be a plan B. But again, you need to be able to deal with the regulatory fallout based on sort of the new operating environment. I think I've answered that.
No worries. Jason Torres comments and says, you've given some great information, but what can I do to address this with $0 based budget, limited staff, and disparate tools?
Wow. That one's well, it's interesting. So if you have the right information available, you can put a lot of those basics in place without any spend other than time and effort of perhaps the staff you have. And I would incent them with, this is an opportunity to sort of raise their experience level in this field, which we all know is growing and in high demand. You can put in access controls with existing networking infrastructure, and you can deal with the fact that you can't necessarily keep your systems up to date. The medical device is a good example, by using what I'll call compensating controls to at least provide you some defense in depth and early warning when things go sort of off or deviate from an established baseline. It's not going to be perfect, but you can make do. And very often we recommend, seeing how you can, work with the tools you have to put the best defense in place, and then you augment, where necessary. And then I would also suggest, and in parallel to that, you want to continue to message to management, to the executive team, to the board, if one exists in your organization, the necessity for providing, the resources necessary to protect the resources, the pace, your assets and patients if you're directly connected. One thing that I've done in board presentations are a whole other thing, but board data should cover a few key topics. This would be one of them, by the way, budget. because it becomes public at that point. The other thing I'd like to do with board data is to show boards who's deviating from a policy. So let's say we have a password policy for the entire organization, but there's certain executives that don't want to have to follow that. That should be something that's reported. It's not to tell on anybody. It's just to say, we have an established baseline of policy. We have 8 exceptions to that, and let them ask the questions.
Very, very good advice. Thank you very much. Question here, how would you recommend getting staff to check if they were the victims of any breaches, as many use the same passwords at home and at work with a work email?
Yeah, that's bad. So that haveibeenpwned.com is sort of the user grade, off the shelf, kind of the consumer grade, that's what I should say, way to check. I use it, and that will, if they use, their Gmail account or Yahoo or AOL, if they still have one, or MindSpring or CompuServe, if I'm speaking a language that no one understands, then I'm dating myself. If you have a CompuServe account or had one, if you put that in that haveibeenpwned.com, it'll bring back all breaches that it's aware of. And it's a database that keeps growing based on known data breaches and exposed accounts. That would be a good starting place. There are many providers that include this now, what we call dark web monitoring for organizations. Some EDR providers will provide this. I think LastPass provides this on a personal level. There's a number of resources available that aren't expensive or costly at all that can work for the organization. But if you were to publish that link or perhaps put it out in a quarterly or semi-annual newsletter, if you have one, and say, hey, we recommend everyone go to this website. No, this isn't a phishing link. Go here, sign up, and maybe do some screenshots. I think that'll help raise awareness. Just about everybody, if you've got an email address that's over 3 or 4 years old, you've been using the same one, it's going to come back with some data breach that their account was discovered in.
Thank you very much. Patricia Miller very openly says, medical devices keep me up at night. Is the FDA pushing better security?
Yeah, so here's a bit of a blind spot. It is, but it's slow. And there's a lot of misunderstanding on this. We do work with a few implant device manufacturers. I'm familiar with the protocols. I'm not an SME on all of that particular, but we do, do some work for those types of organizations. There's a huge misunderstanding that a system is certified. That means you can't change the operating system. That's not necessarily true in each and every case. I'd suggest you dig into that a little bit. You certainly don't want to change anything. You certainly don't want to change anything that has the potential to directly impact patient care, obviously. I'm sorry, I'm kind of lost my chain of thought there. But anyway, yeah, they are, they are implementing more rigorous controls. However, it's a slow process, and there's so many devices out there already. There's so many platforms that are old and that you're not able to do anything about. What you really have to do is wrap security around them and use compensating controls to protect and be able to identify when something's gone amiss.
Thank you very much. Amrit Singh mentions, well, first and foremost, thank you very, very helpful. And then the question is, can you share any specific tools for user awareness training, as that's the most vulnerable point for phishing attacks? How often should they be trained?
Yeah, so I like, I'm kind of partial to KnowBe4, which is a good platform. There are others. If you kind of look at the history of that organization, we use it, and we actually we provide it, we include it with our cybersecurity program because we've had a lot of success with it. We've kept it year over year. It establishes a baseline per user. It's not just, hey, we're going to send a single phishing campaign to the entire user community. You can do that, but when you deploy it, you can deploy it, and it takes at least 5 emails, and it establishes a baseline per user, and it can provide short nugget size training, bite-sized training, if you will, for users as they start, as they kind of make mistakes. I find that very effective. No solution's 100% effective, but there's a lot of good content there. There's content specific to the regulatory frameworks. And you can use that platform to check a lot of boxes. It's not just about checking boxes, but you can meet a lot of your needs and check some compliance boxes at the same time.
Got you. Thank you. I'm just going to keep going with the questions here, folks. They keep coming. Another question I did have, and this kind of relates a little bit to a comment that Sylvia said as well, is, you know, when our own government can't prevent attacks and data loss, where does that leave us? There's a question I actually personally had out of interest around, you know, the SolarWinds breach, etc., and things still unfolding there. How frightened should providers be of similar attacks taking place? How frightened, how worried should providers be of similar attacks taking place?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I look at the SolarWinds as, so my approach is, don't let a good crisis go waste. Don't waste a good crisis. Use it as an opportunity to take, you know, an internal look. And I had another conference I was doing. I had someone ask, you know, so how do we prevent this from happening again? And here's the answer, folks. And it's not just from me. This is from, I've attended a few unclassified briefings from the federal government, NSA, because of my background. And the response is this: you can't prevent these sorts of things. You have to be able to withstand them or recover quickly from them. Going back to the whole resilience concept, you have to have, you know, you have to have systems in place, and you're testing them regularly. This is a life cycle. This is a lifestyle change. This isn't a diet. You've got to get up every morning and throw on the running shoes and go out for a run, whether you want to or not. You've got to test your backups. You've got to test the EDR every quarter or every 6 months to make sure it's working. You've got to have a plan for if your systems go down. This isn't just, you know, and I think of the common scenario with hospitals 5-10 years ago was, you know, fuel plan, generators, depending on where you were. Is it hurricanes? Is it earthquakes? Is, you know, what's the natural disaster that's going to come and knock out our power? Well, now what we see is cyber events are creating more, are causing more business continuity and disaster recovery plans to be enacted than natural events, with a few exceptions. So what I would suggest to you is you plan for this like you would for a hurricane or earthquake or some natural event in your region, and you expect that something like this is going to happen, and you work in solutions, and you build that defense in depth approach and resiliency to your environment. It's all you can do.
Fair enough. DLP, what are your thoughts of deployment, and does it really work?
Yeah, wow. I used to be certified on RSA system. It does work. It's very difficult to do, particularly in healthcare. You have to have the appetite, and most organizations don't, because in my view of the world, it requires a number of things. And one of those is SSL offloading. That means every packet that goes out of the organization gets inspected, meaning anyone's communications, anyone's personal communications. Now you can have some exceptions, but you have to have robust systems. You have to offload SSL. You have to tag the data. You have to have agents on endpoints. There's a lot involved. It can be effective, or you can take a different approach. And if you move some of those platforms to the cloud, some of that capability is provided natively by some of the cloud providers. To do it on what I'll call, you know, a self-contained network can prove very challenging and costly. It depends on the type of data and what you're going to protect. What I would suggest is you can implement DLP for a small segment if you isolate and contain it, and that can be very effective and you know, something that's manageable. But for an entire, like take a 500-bed hospital, very difficult. Very difficult. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be the bearer of bad news.
Right, at all. Is annual endpoint evaluation too little and possible vulnerability? Is there a way to proactively address it?
Yeah, so annual, yeah, so I'd say I'd be happy if I could get every one of my clients to do something annually. And it's not just test one or two, but test, you know, randomly select from different departments, different, you know, functional areas of the organization, and make sure it's working using tools, using some AI and ML tools, using what we call breach emulation tools to emulate the activity, not simulate, but actually perform those actions to see if those systems are detecting or if the telemetry is functional back to whatever system you're using or your provider's using to monitor the environment. Yes, you could do a formal test, you know, more often. or include it as some other thing you're doing if you're doing things on a regular basis. This is more than a vulnerability scan. This is, someone that knows what they're doing or using a platform or both to test, test the system to make sure that it's catching things. And I would be surprised if your organization has more than 300 or 400 users that I would be surprised if it came back, you're good across the board every time. I would expect you're going to have problems. You got to change the oil in your car. It's just part of what you do. So yeah, annually at a minimum, if you can do it more often than that, certainly do that. Of course, there's going to be cost and associated with that.
Fantastic. And final question before we close things off here. Obviously, we asked the audience about what their major concerns are, their top attacks or concerns are. In your personal opinion, looking at all industries and then taking a look specifically at the healthcare space, if you had to choose the biggest cyber threat facing all industries and then again individually the healthcare space, what would that be right now, Ray?
Wow. So I'd say it's 0 day, meaning it's the kind of it's the unknown, it's the ransomware. And I know that's not like a specific thing you can reach out and touch. It's the unknown. It's the SolarWinds, which is really, by the way, it was really just a spy craft. It's government against government. The Microsoft recent Exchange server vulnerability that's being actively exploited by a nation state is another example of it, what I'll call 0 day. Being able, the threat is really, those are the threats, the unknown. And the challenge is being able to respond to those in a timely manner and not be the next victim. Beyond that, and there's, I would say, malware, which includes ransomware, malicious code, which is more than just email. It's also users landing on a website that has active code and they're not protected enough and they ingest that code. And then beyond that, I'd say third party, which includes the other two. Third party risk is huge. Do you know, have you done more than just send out a due diligence questionnaire? Are you confident that your critical providers, I'm talking the ones that actually have your data, support your key systems, have access to these systems. Are you confident that they have the same degree and rigor of cybersecurity safeguard and control in place or better than you do? Because if you're not, you're exposed.
Very passionate answer to the final question of the session. So thank you very much, Ray. I'd like to ask the audience at this point to join me in a virtual round of applause to Ray. Fantastic insight there, not only in the presentation itself, but also in addressing all of the questions coming in. We've got tons of questions.